When Holly and I left our conservative Christian denomination back in 2007, the whole world suddenly felt open to us. Because a lot of ideas and experiences had sparked our interest along the way, but it was really difficult to truly explore those things under the watchful gaze of all the people who filled the pews. We had already pushed the envelope for some time. We snuck away to Jefferson City to attend PFLAG meetings, kind of under the cover of darkness. We went to a UU church to watch documentaries and movies, foreign films and such. And although we knew it was ridiculous that activities like this would be considered suspect by our home church, we also knew being careful was no joke. The social controlling power of the telephone prayer tree, for instance, was very real. Those spindly tentacles, whatever the intention, often fueled the town's gossip. And finally finding ourselves free of that, we could try on any number of ideas, practices, and communities for size. And that included exploring several traditions that fell under the vague umbrella of earth-based spiritualities. I'd first really studied neo-paganism and witchcraft purely theoretically while living in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1990s. In fact, it was pretty hard not to encounter paganism and witchcraft if you were in San Francisco Bay Area then. And I felt especially interested in and drawn to the neo-pagan vision of activist spirituality. I hadn't encountered anything quite like it before. More personally, I was drawn to those spiritual traditions that honored the natural world. There wasn't much emphasis on nature in my childhood denomination. I mean, we had, Baptist Boy Scouts, the Royal Ambassadors. We went camping a couple of times, over the years, and we had those creepy summer Bible camps that we went to that you got to go canoeing on. But just generally speaking, the natural world wasn't part of our faith tradition. We were generally taught that humans were created by God to take dominion of the earth, and that included the freedom to destroy it if you felt like it and could make some money doing so. Encountering traditions where belonging to and caring for the earth as the basis of spirituality, rather than something that required a heated argument to justify, was very refreshing. I also felt profound relief in studying traditions that were not as invested in patriarchal and heterosexual norms. And while I eventually settled into Buddhist and Quaker circles, I still felt at home with those pagan commitments to cultivating creativity and love in resistance to the more hierarchical and oppressive religions of our childhoods. Over the years, I found that these kinds of experiences are not unique at all. Growing up in the 1980s, we were warned about these spiritualities. The popular fears were strangely exciting for many of my conservative community members, climaxing in the annual celebration of paranoia every Halloween. We were solemnly warned about getting abducted and sacrificed on some unholy altar in an isolated forest. And these unfounded conspiracies excited some and terrified many people, and unfairly maligned thousands. However, their delusional flight of fantasy also inspired my friends to find books at the library on goddess worship and to try out Dungeons and Dragons on the weekends. The paranoia, on the whole, did not seem to slow down interest in witchcraft, and it may have encouraged it. Today, most of my friends either identify with atheism or earth-based spiritualities, and sometimes both. This isn't a coincidence. Earth-based spiritualities are often a potent reminder of the tension between oppressed people and their oppressors, and especially of the possibility of power existing outside of acceptable, socially approved channels. As Vanessa Angelica Villarreal has explained, witches are feared because oppressed people with power are feared. For centuries, African, indigenous, feminist, and folk spiritualities have suffered violent persecution and suppression for the mere accusation of witchcraft. In the American Spiritual Lexicon, the witch is an amalgam of deep-seated misogyny and racism, a projection of all that is hated, sexually liberated, unmarried, aging, queer, asexual, embittered, racialized, primitive. She embodies the demonic, immoral forces that seek to tempt and take vengeance on the righteous. The witch, she wrote, is both the silenced, disbelieved, accused survivor and a terrifying threat to white male power, a symbolic identity that deeply resonates with women and marginalized people. How much growth this resonance has led to, especially during the last 50 years, is pretty difficult to measure. To begin, earth-based spiritualities and paganism, these are umbrella terms that gather together a whole host of different beliefs and cultural systems. In fact, the American Humanist Association has listed at least 9 major branches of paganism, each one with distinct forms. To take 2 examples from that list, neo-paganism includes Wicca, which has several forms, neo-shamanism, neo-druidism, asatru, and other forms of Norse neo-paganism, neo-native Native American practices, and the range of practices labeled as women's spirituality. While mesopaganism includes cultures that have been influenced by a conquering culture but has been able to maintain an independence of religious practice, for example, many Native American nations. And although many people have identified some common values and beliefs, such as belief in the sacredness of nature, that diversity still makes it unrealistic to generalize about some single unified movement. This then poses challenges when it comes to demographics. Surveys may lump everyone and anyone not affiliated with a mainstream religion into an other category. And only recently has it become more common to differentiate between different earth-based spiritualities. The information we do have, though, indicates a steady and dramatic increase in practitioners. To take one tradition as an example of this growth, Trinity College in Connecticut conducted 3 large surveys representing the continental U.S. In 1990, the study estimated there were 8,000 Wiccans. By 2008, that number had grown to 340,000 people. In 2014, the Pew Research Center estimated that as many as 1.5 million people in the USA identified as Wiccan or pagan, and that number has only grown. As Carmen Fowler-LaBerge tweeted in 2018, that would mean that there were then more Wiccans in the United States than members of the Presbyterian Church in the USA. Other indicators can be found in popular culture. For example, it's estimated that psychic services in the United States are now worth more than $2 billion each year. And social media has witnessed a huge spike in content related to magic and witchcraft. By October 2021, for example, Witch Talk, a channel on TikTok, had over 19.8 billion views. So hopefully we'll continue to get more reliable demographic data in the years ahead. But for now, what we know is that more and more people are finding meaning and support in these practices and communities. And this is no small thing, especially in light of the persecution that has historically targeted these communities. However, the growth, as it is most of the time, is a double-edged sword. As we've been emphasizing throughout these reflections on demythologizing religion, no spiritual or religious tradition is immune to human limitations or the potential for violence and oppression. So it's important to acknowledge that the rapid rise in popularity has brought with it similar rise in awareness and criticism of earth-based spiritualities and their communities. One important example of this, to use Sarah Lyon's phrase, is the commingling of racism and paganism among white supremacists around the world. The decentralized nature of many pagan movements, which has in itself been a wonderful opportunity that has allowed people to cultivate healthier relationships outside of those rigid forms, has also made it easier for extremists, especially white supremacists, to co-opt some pagan traditions, especially those affiliated with Norse mythologies. In the United States, the Nationalist Socialist movement is pretty much trading in the swastika for the Othala rune. And white supremacist pagans have been on prominent public display at far-right rallies. Like they featured heavily in the Charlottesville rally, Unite the Right, and online, drawing people in with odious calls for faith, family, and folk. Like all racism, these developments are horrible and horrifying. Gratefully, among those fighting back is the broader pagan community. For example, Lyons reported that pagans have formed advocacy groups like Heathens United Against Racism and the Asatru community. These groups have even banded together to form public pronouncements. In August 2016, 43 pagan organizations signed a declaration that publicly renounced hatred and discrimination in the pagan community. Since then, that number has grown to more than 180 organizations in more than 20 countries. So, on the one hand, you have many oppressed communities finally finding not just greater acceptance, but also real opportunities to heal historical trauma, to resist systemic injustice, to build community and careers, and to deepen and create empowering practices. But our social context is complicated, and the results of this rapid growth are mixed. We live in a society that's built around exploitation that leads to widespread alienation and poor health, both physical and mental. It's also built around selling and consuming goods as the focus of life, the meaning of life. And often it's offered to us as a substitute for meaningful change, especially systemic change. Can't solve your problems, but you can buy this product. To complicate things further, our society is currently mired in disinformation, lacking in critical thinking skills, and quite frankly, vulnerable to manipulation. And this makes spiritualities that speak to that alienation and our needed empowerment an ideal target for extremism, as well as an ideal target for commercial commodification and exploitation. And that's obviously not limited to earth-based traditions, but it is perhaps the biggest challenge that earth-based traditions face in our current context. In fact, the rapid rise of earth-based spiritualities has probably made it both more tempting and easier to package up and sell for a profit. That's nothing new. Since at least the 1960s, we've witnessed the commercialization of a hodgepodge of different New Age spiritualities. And that's been complicated by the fact that its consumers have often been from white, upper middle class families who want to take a bit of a creative walk on the wild side. As Villarreal pointed out, as a result, indigenous, Asian, and Black spiritualities, long subjugated as witchcraft, became associated with the eclectic practice of white witches. Today, Instagram is filled with feeds selling ritual items from culturally distinct traditions, all mixed together. Santeria candles surrounded by crystal grids, Palo Santo and white sage bundled with citrine, hands in a mudra position framing a tarot spread, a white woman in dancer's pose with a dream catcher hanging from her big toe. They replicated the existing models, Villarreal wrote, of spiritual and cultural theft in order to capture demand in a lucrative, trending market, demanding access to everyone's culture's sacred tools with no regard for their history. This commodification cannot be separated from the histories of colonization or issues of cultural appropriation or our current social alienation. In Villarreal's words, modern witchcraft's fuzzy spiritual landscape recklessly grabs language and tools from different traditions meant to cope with the brutalities of empire and reinscribes these materials with rootless woo. This recklessness is also driven, of course, by money. From earnest solo practitioners trying to find a meaningful way to pay their bills, to frauds jumping on the bandwagon, to the mass production of trinkets. And while mass production does lower the cost and allow the curious to give a practice a try, it also confuses and conflates unique cultures and histories. For many people, earth-based spiritualities are not even a spirituality anymore. It's just an aesthetic. For example, in the meditation, mindfulness, and spirituality shop at Gwyneth Paltrow's company, Goop, you can buy the Goop medicine bag, which is just a terrible choice of a name, but you can buy the Goop medicine bag, a collection of 8 crystals that we're told encourage clarity, serenity, courage, creative power, and emotional strength. It includes instructions for balancing your chakras, benefiting from their energies, cleansing them in sage or cool water, and charging them in the moonlight. But if those vague spiritual benefits do not appeal to you, you should still buy these crystals. As the website encourages us, not of the spirit set, test this set as a pretty addition to your workspace or vanity. It becomes a decoration. What Goop and most of the other companies adding stones and crystals to their catalogs don't usually tell you is where those items come from or how they were mined. Sourcing is murky, ranging from low-impact, family-owned mines where you can dig for your own crystal if you want to industrial mines owned by companies with terrible environmental records and a history of labor violations. In the latter case, crystals are often what's called a mining byproduct, an unplanned but profitable extraction added on during the process of mining gold, copper, or cobalt. Things that are notoriously ecologically devastating. And while U.S. mines are regulated for at least some environmental and labor impacts, mines in other nations might not be, probably are not. This means that the malachite stone marketed to you to bring wholeness and peace could have very well been mined by a child as young as 7 years old in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's very, very difficult to find out if this is the case. Another impact of this recent profitability can be seen in the global demand for white sage. Smudging, the custom of ritually cleansing a space by burning a fragrant plant, was against the law in the United States until 1978, when Congress finally passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Over the century, indigenous people kept traditions like this alive, despite the very real threat of persecution if they were caught. Now, smudging has been co-opted. It is all the rage. It's become so commercially popular that white sage is expensive and often difficult to find by the very people who work so hard to preserve their traditions for all those years. Unless, of course, you are browsing the more than 1,000 white sage products available on Amazon.com, from incense to body creams. The profitability has driven up illegal harvesting, but it's also made getting caught worth the risk. As Kim and DeGrief reported, a pound of white sage is worth $30 at wholesale prices, with markups up to double that price. That means, quote, a bust of 1,000 pounds amounts to $30,000 sold wholesale, or around $50,000 at market value. This commodification is in stark contrast to traditional methods of harvesting white sage in Native American communities, which is done carefully and prayerfully by hand, and then it is given, not sold. In some, reclaiming ancestral traditions and practices has been empowering and healing for many people who belong to historically oppressed communities, and for others who have been marginalized and find an affinity with these traditions. Meanwhile, though, commercializing earth-based spiritualities in particular has further harmed those very same communities and encouraged people to reduce spirituality to consumption and cultural appropriation. As Jess Joho and Morgan Sung pointed out in their article on how to be a witch without stealing other people's cultures, quote, both the past and present of witchcraft owes quite literally everything to the most oppressed groups in American history. If New Age witchcraft isn't grounded in finally starting to do better by them, then who is modern witchcraft actually for? and what does it serve instead? I've prioritized issues like these because I believe they're the most pressing and important ones facing earth-based spiritualities and communities right now. But there is another aspect that I would like to include today that's most relevant to me personally. Back in 2007, when the world finally felt open and we felt free, we were on our way to go hiking at a state park. And we had NPR on, and there was a radio program that started playing about the rise of witchcraft in the United States. It included an interview with a scientist who was also a witch. In Naturalistic Paganism, he explained, rituals became an opportunity for awareness, to focus the mind and choose actions with intention. Magic operated in the psychological realm, shifting our perspectives and transforming our attitudes. He also speculated about what happened during rituals from a scientific perspective, such as ritually sweeping a circle. I was fascinated by this naturalistic recasting of magic, and it helped me connect with religious naturalism more broadly. The vision is one that I think many people can understand and maybe even appreciate. As expressed in the description of naturalistic paganism at the Spiritual Naturalist Society website, while we find little evidence to support most of the metaphysical claims made for deities and magic, we find plenty of evidence for the capacity of pagan myth, meditation, and ritual to affect human psychology. That is why we find pagan ways powerful. By shaping human minds, they motivate change through human hands. This translates into a practice that views deities through the lenses of metaphor, poetry, and psychology, and not as causal agents external to and independent of the person. Magic shifts from being manipulating energies to produce effects with no known physical causal relationship to our experience, to transforming your own understanding, your own psychology, and your relationships in ways that make change possible. Practices and beliefs are grounded in personal experience, but understood through accurate history and mainstream scientific evidence. And the emphasis on living responsibly resonates, at least with me. On the one hand, they write, naturalism grounded in scientific evidence offers a means of intellectual responsibility. Through it, we cultivate right relationship to objective reality. On the other hand, paganism offers a means for taking responsibility for one's subjective experience and behavior. Through it, we cultivate right relationship to subjective reality. Altogether, ours is a path rich with truth, meaning, and responsibility. Taking time to understand earth-based spiritualities will be increasingly important for all of us for several reasons. Even if you aren't personally interested, you are increasingly likely to know someone who is. And you're also increasingly likely to encounter someone or some website looking to sell you culturally appropriated goods packaged up in a beautiful spiritual box. The more we understand these diverse traditions, the wiser we can be in supporting people who are actively trying to make the world a better place, especially in solidarity with oppressed communities, while avoiding the consumer fads and psychological traps that trick us into helping extremists, frauds, and profiteers. Most significantly, earth-based spiritualities can provide us with some correctives for our alienation from the natural world, while also helping us understand and ultimately dismantle the oppressive systems that persecuted them for so long. And I think that is a vision that all of us can embrace. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.